Hello everyone, this is Alizir Chess here to help you to realize your potential, and today we're going to be studying Wesley So versus Garry Kasparov from the St. Louis Ultimate Blitz Challenge. Wesley So is a multiple-time U.S. champion, a champion of the Philippines, one of the greatest players of our generation. He's beaten Magnus Carlsen in matches before. He's an all-time great, and his peak rating was 28-22, which puts him in the top 10 players of all time by rating. Here he's playing against Garry Kasparov, who is the second highest rated player of all time behind Magnus Carlsen. Also Magnus Carlsen's coach, a multiple time world champion, beating Anatoly Karpov in several matches, beating Nigel Short, beating Viswanathan Anand, and then finally losing his title to Vladimir Kramnik, who was also his student. And yes, we're going to be looking at a Blitz game today from 2016, the St. Louis Ultimate Blitz Challenge. But this Blitz game is very instructive. And this game also, if I didn't tell you the players, you would think that Morphy had the white pieces here. Let's get into it. We have knight to f3, pawn to g6, the modern defense, pawn to e4, bishop g7, d4, taking the center, d6, c4, taking more of the space in the center. And here we have bishop to g4, pinning the knight to the queen. Now, this move is not very good. It would have been better to play either a6, c6, develop the knight to d7, or maybe even play knight to f6, then to get involved with this bishop g4 line, as we shall see. Here, bishop to e2 was played, breaking the pin, knight c6, attacking the d4 pawn, and now we have knight bd2. Here, e5 is played. Here, knight takes pawn does not work due to knight takes, bishop takes, and then the knight moves backward and recaptures, and white wins a piece. So here, after e5 attacking the center, Wesley closes it up with d5, gaining space in the center. Here, Kasparov brings the knight to e7, and Wesley attacks the light squared bishop with pawn to h3. Now, Kasparov moves the bishop back to keep the light squared bishops on the board. Why? Because if you, for example, play bishop takes knight, we have knight takes bishop, and in the event of something like f5, which you would really like to play in these structures, the knight would hop into e6 with knight g5, and this is positionally lost for black already. So black would have to play h6, and the game would continue. Or black could play knight to f6, and then after bishop to d3 to defend the center pawn, castles, c6, and if white plays a slow move like a3, we would have pawn takes pawn, knight sacrifice on d5, breaking the structure, and then pawn to e4, regaining the piece while opening the fianchettoed bishop. And black would have a good position. Therefore, a slow move like a3 is not going to work. White could play rook to e1. And after something like h6, bishop to d2, the game would continue. But here, Kasparov saved the bishop with bishop to d7. And now Wesley played a pawn sacrifice was to move c5. Now, Wesley's threat is to take on d6, and after Kasparov would recapture, then he could put the knight on c4, targeting the pawn on d6. So let's say Garry played a slow move like h6, we would have takes, and knight to c4, with pressure on the d6 pawn already, which is just not good for black, especially since black did not get the King's Indian counterplay off the ground yet, with moves like f5, knight f6, castles, rook f7, bishop f8, and other typical maneuvers to guard the pawn. Also, this knight on e7 is grossly misplaced. This knight does not need to be on the e7 square at the moment. The knight in the King's Indian typically would go to g6 later, but right now the timing is just completely off for black's position. So here, Garry played pawn takes pawn, accepting the pawn sacrifice, and now the d6 square is cleared so that Wesley's pawn can move forward. We have knight to c4. We have pawn to f6, which defends the pawn on e5 that is attacked twice now by both of Wesley's knights on c4 and f3. Now Wesley plays pawn to d6. This move is not the most accurate. The most accurate move would have been bishop to e3, attacking the pawn on c5. A sample line goes b6, pawn to b4, sacrificing the pawn, as we'll see later in the game. Pawn takes, and now d6. And if pawn takes, knight takes, king f8, queen b3, bishop to e8 to cover the mate on f7, rook to d1, knight c6, bishop to b5, attacking the knight because it's only defended by the bishop and the bishop is guarding the checkmate on f7, queen to e7 to put another piece to guard the f7 square, and here we would have queen to d5, hitting the knight, and now the knight is attacked twice, and if it were to move away, the rook on a8 hangs, and the rook on a8 cannot go to c8 to defend it due to the knight on d6. Therefore, knight a5 would just lose the rook in the corner, and knight to d4 runs into knight takes knight, pawn takes, queen takes, and if queen takes this knight, it's mate, and if pawn takes bishop, well, the bishop on e8 is attacked by 3 pieces, so bishop takes bishop wins the game very easily for white. So here, instead of bishop to e3, Wesley played d6. We have knight to c8, which is a great defensive move from Kasparov. Here, bishop to e3 was played, and now pawn to b6. It would have been better for Garry to play pawn to b5 here. Afterwards, pawn takes pawn, queen takes pawn, knight to a3, knight to e7 is not good because of knight takes b5, and if bishop takes the knight, bishop takes is going to be with a check, so you don't have time for queen a5, and if you play queen a5 right now, we can get the queens off of the board, and this black bishop on g7 is behind its own pawn structure. This white bishop doesn't really want to take this knight due to the light squared weaknesses in black's camp, due to all of his light squares being opened. And also, if you were to castle, knight c7 comes, rook b8 putting pressure on b2, and here we have knight b3, and we're just going to go after the c5 pawn, not just for the sake of winning the pawn, but we also get a tempo on the light squared bishop. So if a move like f5 trying to get some sort of counterplay, knight takes pawn, and black is toast. So here, Kasparov missed b5, it played pawn to b6, trying to protect his extra pawn on c5. And now we have castles by Wesley, bishop to c6, and now pawn takes pawn. And now, in the event of Garry trading queens, Wesley would have rook f takes d1, bishop takes e4, rook d8 check, king e7, doubling up on the d file, bishop to f5, and now pawn to b4, again sacrificing the B pawn to open up lines, this time toward the B6 pawn. So if pawn takes pawn, knight D6, and now we're hitting the bishop, we're hitting the knight, and we're also threatening to bring the rook to E8 in some cases. For example, if black does nothing, we could have rook to E8, king to D7, bishop to B5, king takes C7, rook C1, king to B8, and now rook takes knight, bishop takes, and rook takes mate. So here Kasparov has to be very careful, and so he doesn't trade the queens. Also, in case of, in this line, after doubling bishop f5, b4, c takes knight d6, and here, if say knight takes, then we would have rook takes, and if bishop to c8, we have rook takes a7, and the b6 pawn is going to be gone soon. So here, in the game after pawn takes pawn, queen takes c7, pawn to b4, blowing open the c file, pawn takes, rook to c1. Also, if b4, say knight g to e7, we would have pawn takes the possibility, but it would be much, much better to prevent black from castling by queen to b3, because if castles, white has knight takes b6, attacking the rook on a8, and winning the rook on a8, and hitting the queen. So black would have to take back the bishop, which would then be in the corner, and white is much better up in exchange with open lines for the rooks on the c file and the d file respectively. So here, after b4, pawn takes pawn was played, rook c1, getting ready to power up on that c6 bishop, knight to e7 covering the bishop, and queen to b3. Again, black cannot castle because that runs into knight takes b6, was checked. So here, after queen b3, h6 from black, rook f d1, pawn to b5, hitting the knight, and here Wesley, well, can you find his next move? That's right, he sacrifices the knight on e5. Now, after pawn takes, which is pretty much forced, seeing that white is threatening queen f7 checkmate, we have bishop takes b5, and so we've won 2 pawns for giving up the knight, just like in the opera game, but we also have pressure on this bishop on c6 from the bishop on b5 and the rook on c1. Rook to b8 is played, attacking the bishop, and the bishop tucks itself on a4. Now watch Wesley's next series of moves carefully. Queen to b7, rook takes bishop. Now, taking with the queen would lose, obviously, due to bishop takes queen. So we have knight takes, and now we have queen to e6, check. And there's nowhere for Garry to go after knight g7, because king f8 doesn't work due to, can you find it? That's right, it's the beautiful rook to d8. And after knight takes rook, queen to e8, check and mate. So here, knight c to e7 is forced, or just knight e7, seeing this knight is pinned. And bishop c5 attacks the knight on e7, and there's nothing that Kasparov can play in this position. Here, rook to c8 was tried, to cover the knight on c6 again, because the threat is if you do nothing, we're going to have bishop takes knight, check, hitting the queen, queen takes, and now queen takes knight mate. So here, after rook c8, bishop takes knight, Kasparov resigned. So let's go through the game one more time from the beginning. Knight f3, g6. Wesley takes the center. Takes more space in the center. Starts his sacrificial onslaught with c5. Breaks through the position with d6, even though bishop to e3 was more accurate. Kasparov plays the timid b6, trying to protect that extra pawn. b5 being more aggressive, which is typically Kasparov's nature, would have worked better here to try to defend himself. Pawn to b4, another pawn sacrifice to open up the lines before black can castle and get organized. Queen b3 preventing castling. A knight sacrifice opening up the position. A rook sacrifice to remove the key piece that's defending the position, the light squared bishop. Now Kasparov is forced to go into a pin. And now bishop c5, attacking the e7 knight and the e7 square. And this is lights out. There's nowhere for Kasparov to go. Even if, say, king to f8, here that just walks into another pin, and therefore this knight could be chopped off the board. So here, rook c8, bishop takes knight, and that's game. So what do you guys think of this game? Like, I think that this game is amazing. And here I'm going to show some more lines of analysis that I did for those of you who would like to stick around. For those of you who just wanted to see the game, have a great day and thank you for watching. But let's go into deeper analysis here. Some interesting lines. Instead of knight ce7, there could have been knight to b8, c5, takes queen b3 and bishop to c8, and castles, knight d7, a4, knight gf6, a5, b6 is a bad move in this particular position because of a takes, c takes, bishop to b5, and in the event of a6, we have knight takes e5 exclam, and after pawn takes bishop, giving up the exchange, rook takes, knight takes, getting two pieces for the rook. This seems like it would be playable, but it runs into queen takes b5 check, knight back to d7, knight c4, castles, bishop g5 pinning the f6 knight, and if queen c7, we have queen to c6. And here, after the queen swap, the knight on d7 has no square to go to. And therefore, you would lose the piece back, and you wouldn't have two pieces anymore for the rook, but you would only have down the exchange instead. You would only be down the exchange instead. So, also possible is after bishop b5, castles, bishop c6, rook b8, rook takes a7, and white is doing great here. Now, Instead, on move 12 after a5, black could just simply castle here. And black is only slightly worse here. Now, on bishop takes knight, knight takes, f5 doesn't work like we discussed due to knight to g5. But here, if knight to f6, bishop to d3, we covered this line earlier in the video. But to take it further, after rook e1, h6, bishop to d2, knight d7, b4 is a possibility here to prevent knight to c5. And if black were to play a5, white would be actually winning after just simply taking the pawn. And if knight c5, bishop to b4, attacking the knight, threatening to damage the structure. And if knight takes, queen takes, then here the pawn on a5 combined with the dark squared bishop allows for white to have the open b file to use to pressurize the b7 pawn later, and white would just simply win on the queen side. And in the event of f5, we have pawn takes pawn, and then d6 is going to fall. In the event of c5, bishop to c3, f5, and rook ab1, queen d7, and rook b3, and white is doing very well here. Now, after c5, if black were to try to get counterplay going, instead of taking the pawn, but by playing pawn to f5, we would have pawn takes, knight takes, pawn takes pawn, pawn takes pawn, and g4 here, exclam, hitting the knight. And if the knight goes into the center, then we have knight takes knight, pawn takes, knight c4, hitting the pawn on d6. Bishop to b5 runs into knight takes d6 check, and then the light squared bishop on b5 falls with check next move after queen takes and bishop takes b5. And in the event of queen to e7, we have bishop f4, bishop to e5 to block and to defend the d6 pawn twice. Bishop takes, pawn takes, castles, knight f6, pawn to d6, queen to e6, and now pawn to f4 with a strong advantage for white. The computer says that this is a winning position, but you would have to be careful due to the fact that you have an open king. Again, bishop to e3 in this position is better than the game continuation with d6. After b6, b4 takes, push, or b4 takes, push, takes, knight takes d6 is winning, obviously. And here, after knight c8, bishop to e3, Kasparov would have been better served playing pawn to b5, and after takes, knight a3. Knight g7 here is not so great, but knight to d6 is, and we would have castles a6, rook c1, and this is a playable game for both sides, so long as Kasparov wouldn't make the mistake of playing c4 due to pawn to b3, and c3 is not playable here. We have queen to d3, b4, rook fd1, piling up on the knight on d6, and if knight b5, we have queen d5 attacking the rook and keeping the initiative, bishop c6, and now knight takes knight, hitting the queen, also threatening a fork because the king would be in check and the rook would hang. So now pawn takes is forced, and now we have queen to e6, knight to e7, and bishop to c5, attacking the knight on e7 and the pawn on b4, and rook to a7 would just drop in exchange. And there's really not much that black can do in this position due to all the open lines. Bishop takes b4 is coming, rook takes c3 is coming, like everything is hit. And there's also a threat here if bishop takes knight. And if queen takes, then we have queen takes c6 as the follow-up. Again, say if black makes a nothing move, takes, takes, and takes. So I hope you guys enjoyed this game and the analysis. Thank you guys for watching, and have a great day.